just as a quick, I'm sure everybody's here for Quaring debate space, right? Anybody not? Anybody know what Quar is? Just real quick. What is it?
Is it queer black theory?
Sort of. That's an oversimplification version of it. I'm going to give you the detailed version of it tonight. Alright. So, does anybody know who it's written by?
E. Patrick Johnson.
E. Patrick Johnson, right? Professor of Performance Studies at Northwestern University. So this is going to it's kind of difficult to tell you, right, like this is how you quar the debate space, even though that's the title of this. I'd like to recouch it as you have space or not. And we're going to talk about the kind of conversation as to how quar exists as an academic form of theory that is often used in debate space. So before I do that, I'm going to show this clip. Has anybody ever read Black Queer Studies, the introduction kind of to quar? Has anybody ever read the article? Okay, so in the article, he makes reference to this film. It's called Tongues Untied. It's a filmmaker, black queer filmmaker by the name of Marlon Briggs. So I'm going to play a section of this, and we're going to talk about it, and then kind of go from there and have a conversation about quar. So,
my tribe, I'll bring you here, and you will never notice the absence of rice and bridesmaids.
Whatever awaits me, this much I know. I was blind to my brother's beauty, and now I see my own. Deaf to the voice that believed we were worth wanting, loving each other. Now I hear. I was mute, tongue-tied, burdened by shadows and silence. Now I speak, and my burden is lightened, lifted, free.
What is Marlon Briggs doing in this piece? What does he say? What do you think he says? What is your first reaction? Right there. Yeah.
That love between the same gender, especially in the black community, is something that should be accepted, and while it is not accepted currently, it's the revolutionary way of thinking that we have to embrace.
Okay, he says it's a revolutionary act, right? What is your initial emotional response to this piece? The NSTs.
It was sort of like, intimidating, like how it kept going towards his face, and like the words he was using was very passionate.
Intimidating, that's an interesting description. Passionate, okay. What else? Yeah.
I don't know. It wasn't confusing in the sense that I didn't understand it, but it felt like I was missing part of it, I guess.
Okay. What do you see when you see this? Besides, right, you obviously see Marlon Briggs at one point, right? But before that, what do you see? What is kind of the aesthetic of the...
There was a protest?
Okay, so they had a protest, right? What else? What are they wearing?
No shirts, robes.
Okay, yeah, right? But what kind of, like, clothing are they wearing? Like, they still clothed.
Robes?
Not necessarily robes, right? They're kind of like middle class, right? Kind of clothing, kind of look. Would you agree? What do you think they're doing? What are they engaging in? Besides protest. What kind of protest? Right here. Let's try to do it. Kid.
Me?
Yes.
I have no idea.
Victoria, want to help them out?
Things like a heater.
Y'all gotta talk today.
What are they like?
Yeah, what are they engaging? What kind of protest?
Maybe like marriage equality?
That's an interesting one. Marriage equality, we might say that. Right? It's kind of a gay liberation movement, right? Obviously, that Briggs is trying to portray. What is the racial makeup of the men that are portrayed, though, in the protest?
Black.
Yeah, they're black men, right? Why do you think he says black men, loving black men, is the ultimate revolutionary act? What does that mean?
Well, because like for so much time there was like oppression of
produced at the time of kind of the gay liberation movement, right? The rise of queer studies in the academy, things like that. What do you think this particular documentary, when it says black men loving black men is the ultimate revolutionary act, signifies in the context of all of that that's going on?
Possibly the queer theory didn't account for black men loving black men.
Bingo! Queer theory did not account for the racialized experiences of people of color, particularly black men, right? So, Marlon Briggs, in this particular piece, is challenging the static conception of queerness as being something that's historically associated to being white. In E. Patrick Johnson's text, what I know about queer studies I learned from my grandmother. I think that's the actual full title of it, right? He references this particular section of he references this particular section of Tongues Untied. And he cites a queer theorist by the name of John Champagne who criticizes Marlon Briggs' portrayal of this particular act, right? He says, he does a queer reading of this and critiquing the problematic reliance on experience as evidentiary. What do you think that means? Somebody's going to speak right there in the blue shirt.
Like I heard,
He does a queer reading of Marlon Briggs' Tongues Untied and critiques the problematic reliance on experience as something that is evidentiary.
I guess he's saying based on like the experience, you can't say it's like a fact.
Okay?
I think he's saying like when we assume like a queer experience, we always assume it to be white, and queer theory is like built white.
But what do you think John Champagne is saying? That experience is not evidentiary.
It's not indicative of all black queer experience.
It doesn't homogenize experience, right? That would be the kind of code I would use to say that's basically what he's saying. Here's the section of what Champagne does. He says, in Tongues United, one of the consequences of failing to disarticulate in one's reading the hybrid weave of discursive practices deployed by the film might be the erasure of what I would term certain discontinuities of class, race, and imperialism, as they might interweave with the necessarily inadequate nominations black and gay. For example, much of the film seeks to employ a set of discursive practices historically familiar to a middle-class audience, black and non-black alike. The film tends to privilege the discursive experience of middle-class black gay men and is largely articulated from that position. The film privileges poetry, and in particular a poetry that seems to owe as much historically to Walt Whitman and William Carlos Williams as to Langston Hughes or County Cullen. Moreover, the film's more overtly political rhetoric seems culled from organized urban struggles in the gay as well as black community, struggles often heated by largely middle-class people. Another moment in the film that I suggest creates this position as arguably one of the central images of the film, a series of documentary style shots of what appears to be a gay pride day march in Manhattan. A group of black gay men carry a banner that reads, "Black men loving black men is a revolutionary act," apparently echoing the rhetoric of early middle-class feminism. Furthermore, the men who carry this banner are arguably marked as middle class, their bodies sculpted into the bulging, muscular style so prominent in the gay ghettos of San Francisco and New York. So what does Champagne actually criticize about Briggs' portrayal?
That it only targets middle-class black men?
It targets middle-class black gay men, right? He says that Briggs' description of black queer men is one that is heated by middle-class black gay men, primarily because of the aesthetics of the clothing that they are wearing. This is where Johnson begins to problematize our understanding of queer studies, right? So one of the things that Johnson says is that this premises Tongues United on the intersection of race and sexuality, and he makes an assumption that it is targeted to middle-class sensibility, ignoring the fact that many times people will often wear clothing that is not reflective of their class description, right? So he says queer studies is problematic in the sense that it homogenizes how we understand identity, how we begin to think about identity, right? He says queer studies is white and race studies is straight. Queer studies is white and race studies is straight. What do you think that means? Queer studies is white, race studies is straight.
There's no intersectionality.
Yeah, there's no intersectionality, right? So it does not account for the marginalized position of people of color who also might be queer. So, when we say the term queer, what do you think queer means?
Different.
Different? What else? Let's generate a list. Different.
Maybe like somebody with a sexual orientation that's not heterosexual?
Okay, queer can refer to sexual orientation, does it have to? No, why?
It can be pure gender and sex.
Okay, right? It can speak across different forms of gender performances. What else? What else might queer be?
Part of like the LGBTQIA plus community.
It is definitely part of that large acronym. What else?
It might be used for the word weird.
Might be used for the word what?
Weird.
Weird? Okay, yeah, that's what it used to be, yeah.
Everyone that does not fall into such as the race studies or the queer studies.
Right, it can account for like this multiplicity, right? It's kind of like this catch-all umbrella term, right? The other thing that queer can be is something that is fluid, right? Something that you flow in and out of, right? So queer sometimes speaks across sexuality, but is not necessarily something that is embraced by LGBT populations, right? Johnson says this is problematic because it abstracts us from the material reality that we all exist in, right? That when you wake up in the morning, you have to exist in whatever body you are, right? I talked about this a little bit this morning in the realness lecture, right? That you perform, right? You make conscious decisions when you wake up in the morning of what you're going to wear, how you're going to interact, how you exist in particular spaces, how you behave in particular spaces, right? So Johnson's criticism is that that fluidity, right, of identity, this belief that we can have this catch-all term of queer, is insufficient to account for the material reality that that body that wakes up in the morning and goes out into the world has to experience, right? So it doesn't count for violence of heteronormativity. It doesn't account for the violence of racism. It doesn't account for the intricacies of that violence depending on your sexual orientation, right? So he develops this theory of queer. E. Sedgwick writes a book called The Epistemology of the Closet, where they also provide a definition of queer as something that opens up rather than fixes identity, right? It says identity is not something that is fixed. Michael Warner, in The Trouble with Normal or Publics and Counterpublics, talks about queer as something that is politicized and has a polemic view, right? He says the preference for the queer represents an aggressive impulse of generalization. Queer, in other words, in the academy becomes a way to kind of mess up or to desexualize the space of the academy. It becomes this fluid term that anybody can catch on. Butler comes around and writes Gender Trouble, where she talks about queer in relation to gender performance, right? So she says we always perform our gender, right? The body has no ontological status other than the parts that constitute its reality, is what she says. In other words, we don't understand how we exist, how we coexist without our bodies, right, enacting those performances. And so Butler's understanding of gender trouble, right, in Gender Trouble says that we should perform that, and that serves as the basis of both our gender and identity formation. So Johnson says that this kind of definition, right, these kind of static, these kind of unstatic, or these non-fixed understandings of identity can also be dangerous, right, because it does not account for that materiality. He says that when we do that, we fail to acknowledge consistently and critically the intellectual, the aesthetic, and political contributions of non-white, non-middle class gays, bisexuals, lesbians, and transgendered people of color in the struggle against homophobia and oppression. One of the largest criticisms of the queer movement, right, was that it was historically white. It was led by affluent white gay men. I'm sure you know that though, right? So conversations like marriage equality, which is a perfect example given the time frame, right, are struggles that are led by white gay men. One of the major backlashes, right, after the Supreme Court decision a few days ago, right, what was it?
Marriage equality for all, anybody can marry.
Okay, well, yeah, but what was the controversy? What was the backlash within the queer community? Oh, well, yeah, well, no, there's that.
The woman who went to the White House and like talked to the president about like trans individuals being immigrants and stuff like that.
Okay, yeah. So this is a perfect example, right? That even when we have kind of these like large political movements that try to rally us, right, and to organize, that there are still issues that are prominent, right, among transgender people of color, right, among gay men of color, etc., lesbians of color. And so Johnson says that we need a theory that can account for that. So he develops what is called Quaring. Q-U-A-R-E, Quaring. So he says that LGBT people of color do not have the luxury to theorize their identity. Right? They do not have the luxury, they do not get the same kind of privilege to be able to interact in a kind of fluid space. So he says that LGBT people of color, the way they theorize their lives is around a politics of identity. And they're oftentimes accused of being both essentialist and anti-intellectual. What do you think I mean when they're accused of being essentialist and anti-intellectual? Because they ground their identity, they theorize lives around a politics of identity. What does it mean to be essentialist? Or to essentialize? Amit.
To essentialize your identity, I think functionally what he's saying is because they're in such a unique position, you cannot theorize your life without taking into account your blackness and your queerness.
Yeah, right? So, sort of, but what does it mean when I essentialize, right? I group everybody into one big category, right? So if you're a queer person of color, right, where do you identify? Do you identify as queer, or do you identify as black, right? Or a person of color? What do you think?
Both, right?
Yeah, you coexist in both. But queer studies doesn't want people of color, and race studies doesn't want queer people, right? Yeah.
So, Quaring was created as an agenda to include both, as like it was like the marginalized group got together to create their own side of study.
Absolutely. We're getting ready to get to that. We're getting ready to redefine exactly whatever conception you might have of Quaring. So, he says, right, that these two theories, right, these two branches of scholarship that are prominent, right, in the university settings and how we think about and how we theorize about our lives are dangerous because it creates this forced choice, right? And so, he says that so since, right, queer studies doesn't want us, and since race studies doesn't want us, right, we're going to create he creates this theory called Quaring that is a spin-off of the term queer. And he says, so, transgender people, lesbians, and bisexuals of color ground their theorizing in their politics of identity, right? But whites oftentimes will misread this as emotionality. What does it mean for someone to misread emotionality? What does that mean? Y'all gonna speak? Amir. Right? Did I get it right?
Yeah.
Okay.
I'm not sure what he means by that.
What does it mean when whites misread people of color's emotionality as being emotional? Yeah.
They think you just being emotional to like cry, complain, you're not actually dealing with what you deal with.
Yeah. They think you just whining, right? He says that emotion is actually something that's very real, right? That emotion affects how we think about our lives, how we think about our identities, right? And that it's a legitimate branch of scholarship. So Quaring moves beyond theorizing subjectivity, right, and agency as something that is discursively mediated and theorizes how people can propel into action, right? So one of the problems with queer studies is that it problematizes this notion of identity politics, but that there's this gap between theory and practice. Queer studies attempts to keep us in the academy. Quaring studies says move beyond that, right, and talk about the material conditions. So when we define Quaring, according to E. Patrick Johnson, he says it is a theory of and for LGBT people of color. And it focuses attention to the racialized bodies, experiences, and knowledge of transgendered people, lesbians, gays, and bisexual of color. So what does that mean in the context of queer studies? I'll read it again. He says it focuses attention to racialized bodies, experiences, knowledge of transgendered people, lesbians, gays, and bisexuals of color. And it grounds discursive practices into a mediated identification. What does that mean in the context of queer studies? What does it do different than queer studies, besides material realities? Yes?
So I was going to talk to material realities.
Go ahead.
Well, I was like, while queer studies might keep it in the realm of like what and what doesn't substantiate queer, or like academic kind of musings on queer theory, like queer would talk about what material conditions necessitate being black and gay, or non-white and gay. Like it appeals more to the material reality of waking up in the morning and feeling a certain way, as opposed to like theorizing on how we ought to feel.
Okay, yeah, that's one aspect of it, right? Like we change our process of theorizing to look at the material existence, but what else?
I think that definition starts to slowly but surely starts to include the marginalized groups that would be taken out if within like.
Does it slowly start to include them, or does it?
Well, it does.
Who is the focus point for the praxis? Yeah.
What?
No. That's not what he says. What does he say? LGBT people of color.
Yeah.
Right? The theory created for LGBT people of color speaks to that particular social location, right? But it also shifts to where the focus point, right, the starting point for our analysis of queerness, of sexuality, of gender performance, begins with the racialized subject, begins with the racialized body, right? So, one element of queer studies that is important, right? This theory actually comes to exist because of a man named Jose Esteban Munoz. M-U-N with the little thingy above it, O-Z. The what? Yeah. He's going to spell it, so he's got it. So I'm just going to say it. Wasn't very good. It's kind of bad. Anyways, Jose Munoz develops this theory, right? It releases this book, I think it's in 1999. It's called Disidentifications. And somebody really briefly tell me how many's ever heard the term disidentification? What do you think it might mean in the back with the curly hair on the ACES computer? What do you think it might mean, Amir?
Could it be like the identity that society's like forced upon you, is something that you feel you would associate yourself with?
Okay, well that's how society would prescribe us, right? That's basic theory, kind of 101 about how we think about identity, right? Well, what do you think disidentification means?
Like participating in structures that might exclude part of your identity, but like keeping your identity while you participate inside of them.
Re-explain that in a different way. I'm not sure.
I was talking to Curry about this last night. He explained that like inside of a black church that might exclude homosexuality, disidentification would be like still going to that and experiencing part of your identity and retaining the other part.
Somebody else got another definition they think like might be disidentification?
Like you picking which you want to identify at certain times to encompass the material conditions that you deal with.
Okay, sort of, yeah. Disidentification, according to Munoz, is working on and against systems. To work on and against systems, Munoz says this theory is where queers of color work on and against dominant ideology in order to affect change. So he says disidentification is a mode of dealing with dominant ideology, one that neither opts to assimilate within such a structure nor strictly opposes it. Rather, disidentification is a strategy that works on and against dominant ideology. Instead of buckling under the pressures of dominant ideology, things like identification and assimilation, or attempting to break free from its inescapable sphere, i.e. counter-identification and utopianism, this working on and against is a strategy that tries to transform a cultural logic from within, always laboring to enact permanent structural change, while at the same time valuing the importance of local and everyday struggles of resistance. Right? In other words, right, unlike counter-identification that says we should fight back against that particular structure, disidentification recognizes that we are implicated in that structure. because we are implicated in that particular structure, we have to find ways to survive. So for queer people of color, disidentification becomes a survival strategy. So one of the things that Johnson says is that it is not possible, right, for black LGBT members to separate, right, and do its own thing, right? That said, it requires the community. Who else talks about the need for communal identity? What other famous activist scholar person do you think? Starts with an odd. Dree. Audre Lorde, right? She says without community there is no liberation. Right? A major premise for this development of queer studies. Right? So Johnson says that it requires both participation in the community, right? But to disidentify with it, right? So things like the black church, right, are necessary for black LGBT members to be able to survive. Right? It's not possible to escape because of the violent relationship to racism and other forms of structural oppression in society. Right? And it requires tenets of participating in the thoughts of queer studies, right? Why do you think that's true? Even though it's this white-led movement. Eeny, meeny, miny, mo. Right there. The green hair.
Me?
Yeah.
I think probably because like you can exist in that space and like you can exist in a black church and kind of like low-key maintain the other part of identity. You can exist in a queer space and like try not to bring attention to the fact that you like might not, like you might be the only black person there and it's like white dominated. Like it's not your favorite thing to do, but it's like a way to survive so you can be a part of both communities.
Why do you think it is necessary to be a part also, say, for like of the LGBT community, according to Johnson? What do you think he might say?
Because often the black community doesn't necessarily like, I don't know, give good enough regard to queer bodies.
Okay, so he talks about, right, his experience, right? If you read some of his other works like Snapping or Sweet Tea, where he talks about growing up in the black and gay in the South, right? He also says, right, that it is necessary because there's oftentimes difficulty in affirming sexuality, right? And so he says that it is not possible to separate from both communities. So the process of disidentification allows you to interact in both places. And so one of the things that is a central component, at least in some of the more modern literature about queer studies, is work by the name of Marlon Bailey. Butch Queens of Encompass, Ballroom Culture in Detroit. And one of the things he talks about in that text is the violent relationship that black LGBT members have with space. It's in that one. He also does it in Racial Realness. Engendering Racial Realness, I'm sorry. If you want these articles, you can see me later. Get them all to you. And in that violent relationship to space, right, he says that black LGBT members find ways to survive. So when, for example, black people of color oftentimes go into kind of the gay night scene, it's difficult because it's very white-oriented, right? So they develop things like the ballroom. Who knows what the ballroom is? Amit might know.
It is
He's heard it before, at least once or twice.
it's a space for LGBT people of color to assimilate and enjoy sort of not the nightlife culture, but just like a different culture that only a white-dominated queer space would not allow them to enjoy.
Sort of, it creates a space for them, yeah. That's part of it. But what else do you think the ballroom might be? What do you think of when you hear ballroom?
Dancing.
Okay, there's probably dancing.
Enjoying yourself.
Okay, enjoying. That's part of it. But LGBT people of color do what? Yeah, go. Okay, so they might dress up. I'm going to use a different term for it in just a little bit. But they might dress up. What else might happen in a ballroom? They perform, right? In a ballroom, according according to the infamous Dorian Quaring from Paris is Burning, she says in a ballroom you can be anything you want. You're not really an executive, but you're looking like an executive. And therefore you're showing the straight world, I can be an executive. The ballroom becomes a place where you're able to negotiate that identity, right? That says these are the things that have written me out of society, right? I'm too black and too queer to be an executive, right? I don't fit into either categorization. I can't be an executive in the queer spaces, right, because that's for the affluent white gays. So they create these spaces where they can be and perform whatever they want. The central tenet of Johnson's theory of queer studies is that it is something that is performed, right? We embody our identities. So we have to fluctuate, right? So he says that LGBT people of color have to exist in different spaces. So they have to disidentify with structures. So when they disidentify with structures, they're able to effectively resist, right? Because you're able to get by, right? One of the, yeah.
Is anyone who is not queer allowed in the ballroom?
What do you think?
So can debate ever become a ballroom?
Sure.
But
I think it can.
what if the judge is not queer at that point?
Ballroom, good question. What if the judge is not queer? Do you think it can be a ballroom? We're going to talk about kind of ballroom techniques in debate in just a minute. We kind of finished setting it up. Yeah.
I mean, I guess maybe like metaphorically it could be a ballroom, but maybe not the ballroom that a queer person would see it.
Right. Ballroom is about how you perform your space.
Yeah.
Right? So to perform, right, to exist, to embody queerness, is to embody a performance. Right? So this classroom is not really a classroom, right, until you come in here and you sit down, right? You open up your computers, you take notes, you hear me talk, pretend like I know some things, right? But when you leave this room, if I take all of these desks out, right, it's just 4 walls and a floor. And it's only 4 walls and a floor because I said that's what it is, right? Because I have named it that, because that is what I envision that it is, right? So the violent relationship to space for LGBT people of color is about constantly negotiating those spaces, right? So a ballroom can be anything, right? Dorian Quaring says it best at the end of Paris is Burning. She says the goal, right, when LGBT people of color leave the ballroom is if they can go home and they can pass as straight, if they can get down, and she's writing this, mind you, in the context of New York City in the 80s in the midst of AIDS epidemic, etc. She says that they can go home and they can get on the subway and they can pass it straight and make it all the way home without having any bloods, any knots, anything else like that, right? You have successfully engaged in what? What is the term? Realness, right? You are real. I think that's yeah. You are real. Right? Yeah.
Wait, I don't understand. You are real if you successfully got home safe.
If you successfully got home safe.
Because you successfully
because you have passed.
Passed what?
You have passed, right? You have not been identified as gay, right? Mind you, she's performing, she's doing this documentary in the midst of the 80s, right, where homophobia is very, very prevalent, right? Violent forms, right? Yeah.
So, in LGBT culture, those folks who, there's different ways of communicating. So just like in the black community, brown communities, there are different ways to communicate and to identify folks and to speak amongst yourselves, right? So when you want to speak about people who may not be LGBT, you may reference, and you look over and say, are they family? Now, I can ask Chris, like, is this person family? How many of y'all know who's in the family? Who's family? Victoria. I want to know if that person is gay. Right? Now, there's also a question of, can you be clocked? What's clocking? Right? So what Chris is talking about is, are individuals, how many of you think you have good gay guard?
I think I'm okay.
Okay. So if somebody's walking down the street, right, I said, oh, clocked. What time? I'm 5'10". Thanks. Right? To be clocked is for someone to recognize or to read your body or your performance as gay, as LGBT, right? You can be clocked as Latino, clocked as black, clocked as in the closet, right? So when she said, when Dorian says that you have made it home, you are real, it means that you have prevented, your performance was so on point, right? It was so authentic. It prevented you from being clocked as something other than what you wanted to be identified as.
So disidentification then, right, allows you to create terms like realness, like clocking, like family, right, and reclaim those terms in a way and redefine those terms in a way that allows you to pass the untrained eye, right? So for straight folks, right, are not able to identify, right? And for even sometimes for LGBT folks, not able to identify within the context of the ballroom culture, right? Yeah, you had a question.
So is the entirety of disidentification just a method so you don't get clocked? Or
Disidentification, good question. I think I'll answer that right now. So, which is exactly what I was getting ready to do. Disidentification, in other words, according to Munoz, is something that can be understood as a way of shuffling back and forth between reception and production, right? You are able to negotiate spaces, right? That there are times where over-the-top flamboyancy is okay and acceptable and it's safe, right? There are times when it is dangerous, right? Disidentification allows you to negotiate those spaces in a way, right? Yeah.
So if you have told the judge you are queer and the judge has clocked you as queer, then you have not been real because you've been clocked.
If what?
If the judge has clocked you as queer, then you have not been real at that point because you've been identified.
Sure, under very basic interpretation, but those negotiate based on the situation, right? The thing that is important to understand about the theory of queerness, right, the theory of the ballroom scene and the culture, right, is that it is something that is always situational, right? That there are constant negotiations, right? So when I say not being able to pass, right, that might just mean I don't disclose sexuality, right? So if I stand up and read just a regular 1AC, I might not disclose who I am, right? I just talk. Sometimes that fluidity is necessary, right? So under the logic, to pass, to blend, is to survive. So queer theory is the kind of ultimate embody of this, right? It's situated in this kind of understanding of disidentification, one that is performed, that attempts to produce an image and have that image received, right? So when you are negotiating a space, you are trying in a way to have them perceive you the way you want them to perceive you. So it is about controlling the production of one's image, right? So Johnson says for those that are disenfranchised, the need to control the production of one's image is one that is necessary. Yeah?
Wait, so why is it bad to be perceived as queer?
It is sometimes dangerous, right? According to Johnson's theory, it is sometimes dangerous. There are times when the negotiation of sexuality in a public space can be dangerous, right? It can get you fired, it can get you from getting an apartment, it can keep you from getting a job, it can keep you from moving up, right?
But it's not necessarily
can it also
bad.
kill you?
It can also kill you, right? It can be violent, right? So there are tons of examples, right, in recent history, recently, right, like with transgender people of color, right, being murdered daily, right, because they are transgender persons of color. It is that negotiation, right? So the problem then with queer theory, right, with queerness, this concept of queerness is that it says that material reality is does not matter, right? Because it starts from this conception of performativity, right? How many was in the realness lecture today? Can somebody tell me what they think performativity is? Who wants to take a guess at it?
Was it questioning the space or the subject around you?
Yeah, it questions the things that make you up, right? Instead of the subject itself. So Johnson actually indicts the concept that Butler says that is good about performativity, right? That performativity is dangerous because when it distances us from that, then we don't see, right? We see various dimensions of one's person, right? One's personhood, but we never examine the subject, right? And the violence that happens to the subject. So disidentification queer theory then attempts to produce the image, and like I said, have it received. And so when it is received, it is that moment of survival politics that exists.
So optimally, there will be no need for survival, survival instincts for them.
What do you mean?
In terms of being queer, in an ideal society, you wouldn't need to
to be in an ideal society, but Johnson problematizes the notion of the ideal society, right? He says that's not the reality, right? And so queer theory says, yes, we should all be included, right? Quarr says that's not sufficient, right? Because the first step to that is to start with those material conditions, yeah.
Okay, so I'm a little confused as to this term real that keeps getting thrown around. So like this identification is a way to be, it's a way to be seen, or a way that you can see yourself as real by not being real to the rest of society, or like by not being yourself.
To be real means I can pass, right? So if I say that I am a business executive, right? If I can pass your eye as a business executive, right, I have engaged in a form of realness, right?
I think what would be helpful is and/and
Oh, like, talking about like real as in,
no, in the where he does the and in the asterisk and exclamation point.
oh, you're talking about, I don't remember how to say it. Do you remember? I know what you're talking about.
Okay. So, David. Alright, why is that relevant to you, Pastor Johnson's work versus someone else's work? Why is this about?
Like you have to choose in one and you can be everything in the other. And like there's an asterisk, so it could like continue theoretically.
Yes, that's exactly what that means. There's an infinite number of ands that are added to this point, right? So when Chris is saying he could be a businessman, right, and that's a question of real, today I want to be an astronaut and I want you to perceive me as one. Tomorrow I want you to perceive me as a PhD. The next day I want, or even in 5 minutes from now, I want you to perceive me as the world's greatest drag queen. 5 minutes from then, I want you to perceive me as the president. Yes.
Aren't all our hopes and dreams function in the same form?
That is a deep existential question that I would need you to bring me in on.
Like, whenever you say that you, like, whenever you say you want to be something, but you're not sure if you can be that within society, does it just say that you're...
I think that's a distinct question. So, E. Pastor Johnson is not, I don't think, answering the question of can you be anything or like have a specific career. His argument is, so you're walking down the street. Who is it that you see? So how many people perceive me as female? Why not? What about me? What? Tell me. Okay, what else? Yes.
Maybe your posture, the way you stand, isn't considered like generally feminine.
Okay, what else? There's markers, yes.
You have a deep voice.
Well, it depends on the day. Go on, yeah.
Your hair is probably more masculine, it's not super long.
Amit?
How you dress.
I'll say it's a little queer today. So each of these things would prevent me from performing or being read as woman, right? At least for today. But if I came in tomorrow and walked past a lot of you and I was dressed completely differently, some of you like, what's that? You want woman? Right? That is a question of realness. Can you be the person who you left out of your house deciding that you want to be perceived as? Not a question of can you get a job, because structural violence, E. Patrick Johnson doesn't believe that like whiteness is a thing. But when you see me, who do you see? Black. Of all of the parts of the people, black.
This makes sense.
and so Quark, right, becomes an embodied sense of performance for him, right? And I can be both. So he says we need a theory that explains this, right? That explains this distinction between and or versus and, or both and, right? So he says performance and Quark studies, and I quote, performance and Quark theories alert us to the ways in which these disidentificatory performances serve material ends. And they do this work by accounting for the context in which these performances occur. The stage, for instance, is not confined solely to the theater the dance club, or the concert hall. Streets, social service lines, picket lines, loan offices, and emergency rooms, among other things, may also serve as useful staging grounds for disidentificatory performances. Theorizing the social context of performance statues the gap between discourse and the lived experience by examining how quars use performance as a strategy of survival in their day-to-day experience. Such an analysis requires that we, like Robin Kelly, reconceptualize play performance as work. Right? Moreover, quar theory focuses attention on the social consequences of those performances. It is one thing to do drag on the club stage, yet quite another to embody a drag queen identity on the streets. Bodies are sites of discursive effects, but they are also sites of social ones as well. Right? So, what is he saying? What do you think he's saying?
It may be harder to be like a drag queen on the streets because it's very dangerous than it is to do that in a controlled setting.
Yes, right? That is part of it, right? That it is different, right? When you enact drag on the street versus when you enact drag in the club. It is different, right? When you are dancing in the club versus dancing on the street. He says those material conditions change depending on the situation and the location that you are in. It also means that quar studies, right? Quar as a theory allows you to understand the political nature of the performance, right? So if I choose to enact radical drag on the street, right, I might be making a political statement. It might be just who I am, right? But it still has a political meaning behind it, right? And those meanings change depending on the context by which they are situated, right? So performance, understanding quar as performed, allows us to shift our attention to understand both the historical context and the lived reality that it exists in, right? Performances do not exist in isolation with one another, right? But they have significant meaning tied to social structures. So quar begins a process of theorizing about that by focusing on those material conditions. Is everybody with me? So what does that mean in the context of quarring the debate space? What do you think it might mean to quar the debate space?
Like using the debate space like the ballroom to like express like stuff.
That is one thing you could do, right? You can turn debate into a ball. We did that quite a lot this season. Embrace some realness, yeah.
I think it basically has to do with introducing radical ideas that would be rejected in normal academia and debate space.
Okay. It embraces an idea, right, or a theorization of identity that is oftentimes rejected in the academy. Brings it into the debate space.
Challenging the normativity of the debate space.
Challenging the normativity of the debate space. Is quar theory really different than anything else? What is the fundamental distinction between it and other theories?
Black and queer versus just black or just queer.
Okay, well that's part of it, yeah. I mean, that's a fundamental distinction, right? But I mean, we've got tons of intersectionality literature.
So disidentification would be the fundamental.
Well, yeah, you've got disidentification, that's part of it, but I mean, there's other authors that write about a white form of disidentification. What do you think makes the fundamental distinction between understanding quar theory in the debate space or quarring the debate space versus other theories?
I think there's just a lot less limits to it.
What does that mean?
I don't know, like, I keep looking at that theory and like, I feel that most theories would like function under that and or structure, and like quar theory specifically allows you like to do like different forms. There are different ways to present things.
Okay, yeah, that's true, right? Like one of the major fundamental distinctions is that debate oftentimes tries to create this and or distinction about how we think about things, right? It is either this or it is this, right? There is one absolute truth versus another absolute truth, right? We think of debate in oftentimes binaristic terms. Quar theory, introducing quar into the context of the debate space, suggests that that's just not true, right? It says that people always embody this and distinction. You good back there?
Yeah.
Okay, just making sure. I saw a smile, so just making sure. So we got this and distinction, right? That breaks this binaristic conception of debate. But it also suggests something else, right? That the debate space no different than any other place of the social structure, any other type of social structure, any other type of space, right? That in the debate space, it is oftentimes necessary to enact survival strategies in order to just exist, right? Discourse on handgun control policies, discourse on environmental racism, discourse on, or environmental pollution for that matter, just in general, right? Discourse on domestic violence, discourse on whatever it might be, starts from a static understanding of what those terms mean. Quarr reinvents those terms. It allows us to redefine those terms in a way that allows us to understand the interaction and the complexity of identity in relation to those conceptions. Right? Yeah.
An example of this that E. Patrick Johnson uses is during slavery. Who knows what the importance of hymns were during slavery?
The what?
A hymn?
Oh.
Like wade in the water? Yes.
They were supposed to like bring back a sense of hope.
Okay. Yes, that was there because it could be for a religious purpose, right? Because it was the white man's religion because they want to save black people, so then they took that on. But then that even took on a deeper meaning, right? An infinite number of meanings for that community, and they sang wade in the water as a means of escape. Right, so the night that there was going to be somebody like Sojourner Truth who's going to lead you to freedom, the slaves in the fields would sing wade in the water. So you knew during the full moon to go down into the water and wait until you heard a signal, and that would be your means of escape, which is why Chris explained the question of working on and against the system. So you were on slavery, you accepted that identity as a slave, but used it to push against your identity as a slave to become free.
Since we're almost out of time, I want to end with this last section from Johnson, because I think this kind of sums up exactly the kind of purpose that Quarr serves both in the academy and outside of it. And as we think about these concepts of survival strategies, right? We hear the term survival strategies a lot of times in debate, that we need new strategies of resistance. So here's what he says in saying about his kind of tracing of Quarr. He says, thus far I've canvassed the trajectory for Quarr studies in the academy, focusing on the intellectual work that needs to be done to advance specific disciplinary goals. And he says, while there is an intellectual work to be done inside the academy, what one might call academic praxis, there is also political praxis outside the academy. If social change is to occur, gays, bisexuals, transgender people, and lesbians of color cannot afford to be armchair theorists. Some of us need to be in the streets, in the trenches, enacting the Quarr theories that we construct in the safety of the academy, while keeping in mind that political theory and political action are not necessarily mutually exclusive. Quarr theorists must make theory work for its constituency. Although we share with our white queers, peers, sexual oppression, gays, lesbians, bisexual, and transgender people of color also share racial oppression with other members of our community, and so we cannot afford to abandon them simply because they are heterosexual. Although engaged in heterosexual behavior, Kathy Cohen writes that straight African Americans have often found themselves outside the norms and values of dominant society. This position has most often resulted in the suppression or negation of their legal, social, and physical relationships and rights. So Quarr studies must engage in strategic coalition building around laws and policies that have the potential to affect all of us across racial, sexual, and class divides. He proposes that Quarr is something that is necessary to form coalitional politics, right? That we all have some kind of common goal, right? That there is some kind of shared, at least experience in the sense of a struggle, right, within the legal, political, and cultural frameworks. And he says that coalition building is necessary. We must figure out where identities and things like that overlap with one another. And the last thing he says, because I am not convinced that queer studies, theory, and activism are soon to change, I summon Quarr studies as an interventionist disciplinary project to address the concerns and needs of gays, lesbians, bisexual, and transgender people across race, gender, and class, as well as other identities and subject positions. And while attending to the discursive fields of knowledge, Quarr studies is also committed to theorizing the practice on everyday life. Because we exist in discursive as well as material bodies, we need a theory that speaks to that reality. Indeed, Quarr studies may breathe new life into our dead or deadly strategies of survival. Yes, sir.
If you're engaging in an act of quarring the debate space, would you consider it a negation if somebody said that we need to get out of the conception that LGBT people of color or racialized LGBT bodies need to stay in quar and need to get out of quar and move into queer? Like, would you say that somebody saying that the time for quar is over, the time to include racialized bodies into queer?
That would not be theoretically nor practically possible according to Johnson's conception, right? He would say that queer studies does not account, it has a completely wrong starting point, right? And so the foundation of queer theory, of queer studies, is insufficient to ever resolve the concerns of LGBT people of color, right? He says queer becomes the interventionist approach that saves queer, right? Not queer saves queer. Yes, sir?
So then that would be one day they would resolve to quar instead of queer.
I don't think he takes necessarily kind of like an end goal. He says that queer is just an interventionist project, right? So he never says that there is an end goal, right, to resolving kind of these legal, structural, or legal, political, and cultural battles, right? But he says that it becomes an interventionist approach to help us to begin to form coalitions, right? Yeah.
Okay, so sometimes debaters are often criticized for not staying true to their arguments. For example, you run Afro-pessimism one round, next round you run straight policy out. Could a core person identify with seeing a different judge in the back of the room? So their survival strategy this round would be a policy app, and the next round would be Afro-pessimism?
It's quite possible. Absolutely. Right. My argument is not that, right, that a queer person exists in the debate space, but that the debate space becomes inherently queer because those people exist in the space itself, right? So queerness is inevitably tied to the performed body, right? So when you begin thinking about queerness as just an argument, right, you have missed the project that Johnson engages in.
Right.
Johnson says it's not just a theory, right, but that it has material effects on people, right? So queer becomes kind of the theoretical framework to explain how people coexist, right? How people disidentify with structures, how LGBT people of color have to engage in that fluidity. Yes?
Oh, so it's like you said that the space of debate becomes inherently queer because queer people exist in it. Are there any spaces that adopt that nature? Because it doesn't seem like the normal outside society becomes inherently queer, but there's still oppression.
Queer bodies exist everywhere, right? Johnson says that people who would be considered queer according to his framework, right, coexist within society, right? The question is whether or not they pass or not, right? Whether or not they have, what depends on what circumstance, what situation, what space you're in, right? So sometimes it might be more dangerous for me to perform my identity in a particular round than it might be in others.
Right.
There are certain instances of individuals, right, that I would never want to talk about that in front of. There are others that I probably need to, right?
So I guess my follow-up question is does a space being queer simply say that there are queer bodies inside that space, or does it imply something else?
The space becomes queer at the moment when those queer bodies exist, right? What that means, however, changes depending upon the situation itself. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yes, sir.
Does queerness only depend on sexuality and color?
Good question, right? So the problem that Johnson had with queer, right, was this notion that anybody can kind of be encompassed under queerness, right? He is very clear in his text that it is for lesbians, gays, bisexuals, and transgender people of color, right? So he very much limits it to both that kind of gender performance, right, and sexuality, right? But that it has the potential and radical potential to reach across and build coalitions with others, right? So he basically says, no, you don't get to co-opt, right, queerness as kind of everybody's marginalized in some capacity, right? He says there are real effects to our discourse. There are real effects to the things we speak. And so he problematizes that notion for that very reason. Because queer studies didn't deal with those effects. Yes?
Sorry, so to be clear, the rest of the LGBT acronym will not be allowed in queer.
That's not necessarily true. Because he says it allows for strategic coalition.
But
I would defend that he says that it has the potential, right, to, mind you, he's writing in 2006, right, so at the time where he's writing, LGBT, right, would be kind of a thing, right, that's kind of the only acronym. That said, I can't speak for Johnson, but I would suggest that he would probably say the Q part of LGBTQ, etc., right, would probably not be included in that acronym, right, because Q starts from that foundation, yeah.
Is he just asking for like more concrete like situations than queer, or is he like specifically talking about sexuality, right? Because there are other more like concrete identities within the queer community. Like, would those be included, or would he say that like that's like when we're reaching into groups that like are just too like, I don't know, nebulous within the queer community?
So I think that E. Patrick Johnson's argument is that queer can speak to and across and also produce new identities, which is why he argues that is a more utilitarian form of identity politics, because it doesn't just speak to what already exists, but it speaks to what could be, right, based on like a radical notion of subjectivity. So today, I might not be male, I might also not be female, I might not be anything of any of those things, but I might also be all of them, right? But that is why queer politics is important, because both racialized politics and also queer politics historically have been too rigid and non-accepting of new emergent forms of identity.
When we started the lecture, there was an emphasis on the fact that that the representation that was critiqued was queer, black, but middle class. How much does socioeconomic status relate to queer?
Yeah, good question. So in the textual analysis that he does, or in the analysis that he does with Champagne's criticism of Riggs, right, he says that there's basically this assumption, right, that has been made according to Champagne that, right, because they are wearing kind of a blue clothing, they must be upper middle class, right? Johnson's argument is that's not true, right? That so you've got things in the ballroom, for example. Bailey does some work on this. In the ballroom, he says there are things like the concept of mopping, right, where people steal from like clothing stores, right, in order to survive. So they steal from very wealthy, right, white-owned stores and wear those clothing in the ballroom. So the essentialization that he engages in so the essentialization that Champagne, for example, has of Riggs' work is dangerous because it doesn't account for those kind of things, right? Those are also just as much survival politics that are tied to the complexity of both class, sexuality, right? Being able to perform that sexuality in the ballroom scene and also being racialized, right? So those things are always interconnected with one another, right? So other theoretical approaches and things like that don't want to account for those things. And so he says, right, those are necessary. So when you've got things like stealing that happen from stores, what does that mean? What are the reasons why that happens, right? Queer allows us to analyze the structural conditions that allow those things to happen or necessitate those things to happen. Any other questions? All right, if you have any other questions, I'll be around office hours. I don't know if I will be or not. But,